it seems to me that the very first beginning, and I'm talking about Pandemic 2, the first beginning of it is very, very important when it talks about bioweapons and the offspring of bioweaponization in being possibly the COVID. And it talks some figures, statistics, evidence, papers. Does that for about 10 minutes. To me, that's the best bit of the film. And I would say to the Pandemic team, they ought to go back and revisit that data and make a whole documentary just about that issue. Is this COVID thing a bioweaponization? That's the first and most important question we still haven't asked. What they then do, and I think this was, it's their thing, right, is they then launch a fearsome attack against scientific pharmaceuticals, and they pin it to J.D. Rockefeller as if he's responsible for the whole thing. You know, that's just an oversimplification. Obviously, I know the Wellcome Institute in London. I did part of my degree in medical history at the University of London. And, you know, Wellcome is another pharmaceutical company. There are many in Europe, and you can't just blame pharmaceuticals for COVID. I mean, that's committing so many ethical errors that it's actually muddling up two issues. The history of pharmaceuticals and their relationship to natural medicine is a really interesting field. I taught a whole series of courses at the University of Oxford on religion and medicine. And I've gone into this in enormous detail. Now, I'm an expert on the history of religion and medicine. I've still got the lecture notes I gave. I recorded some of the classes. I always intended to write it up as an encyclopedia. If I live long enough, I will. Because, what was Buddhist approach to medicine? And it's to do with the mapping of consciousness, because Buddhist doctors, be they Tibetan or wherever, Thai or whichever part of the Buddhist world, they will work with your consciousness as an ally. They won't work with just your physical symptoms, because they believe that your physicality is a manifestation of your spirituality. I looked at Hindu medicine and how that works, Ayurveda. I looked at Chinese medicine. I looked at ancient Greek medicine, the origins of Western medicine, when it was still a sacred science, at the time of Hippocrates and, the Guild of Asclepian doctors. They regarded medicine as a sacred calling, which I do too. I worked in hospitals for 6 years, really, in total. And I have a huge respect for doctors. So to just sort of shout and say, all these pharmaceuticals are wrong, I think is a way ridiculous oversimplification. Also, to say that Rockefeller's the cause of them all is just ridiculous. I mean, that's just absurd. Yes, he invested in them. He wheeled and dealed to get control of, in America, of the pharmaceutical industries. But, he thought he was doing the right thing. Okay, then the movie. So there's a lot of nuances there that are missing. Then the movie shifts to a full frontal attack on vaccination, and Bill Gates in particular. And again, it's muddled. It seems to be arguing that Bill Gates is an evil genius, and I think if you kind of read it without any background training, you might come away with the impression that Bill Gates has invented COVID in order to sell more vaccines. And, he's taken over the World Health Organization to make all that possible. I mean, this is fantasy land. This is conspiracy fantasy. I don't think, Bill Gates is that evil. I don't think anybody is. Nobody in their right mind would ever think of, I tell you what, we'll launch an evil virus that can massacre humanity and then we'll make lots of profit from vaccines. I see no evidence that and if that were even slightly possibly true, if there was any evidence, then the guy should be arrested, obviously. The guy's a mad psychopath. Like the Joker in the Batman movies or whatever. He should be arrested and tried. The fact that he isn't being, that nobody among all these pandemic types have actually, as far as I can tell, got any actual evidence against him, means to me that he's probably innocent. And there is a thing in law, you don't judge somebody until they've been proven guilty. I would say the same, the other people is Sacha Stone and his Truth Commission, that again, they've demonized Bill Gates to a horrific extent. Well, I'll believe in their integrity when they invite Bill Gates to come and give evidence to them. You see, if they're trying to be a neutral justice organisation, which they say, they have to hear from all sides. Now, I don't know if they've reached out to invite Bill Gates to speak. They ought to, and get him before their panel and grill him. So I'm just saying that I think it was very one-sided to attack Bill Gates in this way without giving him any kind of defence, just taking clips of his stuff that makes him look ridiculous. You could do that with anyone. And I think the issue of, the whole question of whether vaccines work or not is a totally separate issue, which is important and needs to be gone into really in a detailed way. Mass vaccination may or may not be part of the solution to the crisis we're all facing. What I do know is that we still have to work out the etiology of this disease. We don't know its etiology, its cause scientifically. And that's the first duty of a doctor, is to find the cause of the illness. And I'm speaking as a medical historian, an expert in the philosophy of medicine, from a particularly a religious perspective. All medical doctors in the world, the first thing you do is find out the cause, because there's no point healing somebody if the cause is still present. If they've got noxious fumes in their room that are making them feel ill, you treat the symptoms, send them back to the room and they get more noxious fumes. That's not doing proper medicine. So I would like to see from Plandemic, I'd like to see a Plandemic 3 or 4, in which they go into absolute fine detail on the first sequence of this, number 2, on the bioweapons issue. Let's nail that, let's find that. Go and interview the people that might have made it. Go and interview the UN and ask why they haven't actioned the Bioweapons Convention, which they mention vaguely in this Plandemic 2, but they don't take it, anywhere. And to me, that is a moral oversight, because that's the key question to ask. And it makes me a bit suspicious of the Plandemic team, because they can't be so stupid that they hadn't thought of what I'm saying, right? So it's almost like it's deliberate misinformation. It's like, we'll create huge scares about vaccines, we'll create huge scares against Bill Gates, we'll whip people up against Rockefeller, which is, an old thing. People do that all the time. I'm surprised they didn't throw in the Rothschilds and the other elites, and then we're into QAnon territory, because, that it's easy to whip up, hysteria against elites if they happen to be rich. Oh, they did have Epstein appear, and Epstein apparently knew Bill Gates. So this proves the theory that Bill Gates is really evil, and therefore is responsible for the whole, coronavirus and everything, evil genius. Well, there's a mistake in logic there. The fact that a rich guy in New York, Epstein, who was hobnobbing with everybody, happens to, have met Bill Gates a few times. I mean, it would be funny if they hadn't, actually, because they're the same, that elite group of people, they all go to the same parties, they holiday on the same yachts and so on. I have to say, they're out of my league, I've never met Epstein or Bill Gates, but I have met some quite rich and influential and powerful people who've been on the good side, and I also can spot propaganda and illogical stuff when I see it. So anyway, I suspend judgment on that crew who make the Plandemic stuff. I'd like to see the film about the bioweapons thing. That would be worth making. And if they don't want to make it, I'll make it. And if you want to help me and help make that, then let's get on with that. We might need some funding. Right, what else? Okay, so I've been working on my book on religion and maths, which I mentioned. Principia Religio Mathematica. I mean, this is a huge work, right? This is the Leibnizian take on what is reality? Is it mathematical, or is it ethical, or is it spiritual, or is it all three? I take the view it's all, and I'm trying to get this communication going between religious thinkers and mathematical thinkers, and at the moment there's a complete non-toing and froing. It's like different continents. So that's why I'm doing the work. And I've been working on Buddhism and maths, Hinduism and maths, Jainism and maths, Israel, Jewish religion and maths. And, I'm working through. It's really interesting and very demanding, actually, intensive research. It's led me to a reflection when I was working on Israel and mathematics. So many Jewish intellectuals in the last 200 or 300 years have been profoundly influential mathematicians. It is amazing when you look at the lists, and they've won so many Nobel Prizes and so on. And why? Why is the Jewish intellectual so attracted to maths? Partly I think it's the Bible itself is quite mathematical. Partly it's because God is one is a mathematical proposition, so they're starting out with a mathematical idea. I think the Talmud and centuries of Talmudic scholarship, that's quite a mathematical text as well. And I think that the Kabbalah is also, quite mathematical in its outlook, its map of cartography of consciousness. So I think these are all factors. And I point out in the book that one of the great mathematicians of Israel was Karl Marx. Now, this is not really known. People don't realise Marx was a mathematician. They think of him as a philosopher, which he obviously was. But somewhere along the way, he picked up some pretty advanced maths. He was really into calculus. He was trying to invent single-handedly a mathematics that would explain capitalism. I mean, one of his relatives was a banker in Coutts, one of the great London banks, who employed Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond books in the 20th century. The Marx family came from bankers, capitalists actually, a lot of them. And they were really good at numbers and maths, and Marx had that. But he turned to the other side and wanted to help the poor, and wanted, therefore, to figure out how wealth gets creamed off from your and my labour and ends up in the banks of rich capitalists, in the Cayman Islands. What's the mechanism whereby my sweat and my blood and my tears are transformed into your capital in your bank offshore? Well, that's a really, really important question that Marx took on. And the thing is, he didn't ever complete Das Kapital. I'm working on a commentary on Das Kapital, and I can assure you, I haven't finished it yet, that he never finished it. So I'm working on a commentary on an unfinished book. But that's enabled me to look ahead and see which bits he left out. He said in volume 3 that he was going to finish it by doing this and doing that, and he would write about this and that. And it never got written up. Even volume 3 was just notes that Engels found, because obviously they kind of wrote it together. Him and Marx had these late night conversations in their house eventually in Hampstead, and near where I nearly lived for a while. So it's an unfinished work, sadly. Right. In addition, Marx left out a huge gaping hole. I mean, there's things that are unfinished that he said he was going to write, but then there are things that he never thought of, which he ought to have written. And as a scholar, a philosopher of history of ideas, I can spot the differences. I mean, I was trained by people that work with Isaiah Berlin, who's one of the great intellectual historians of the 20th century, a great thinker, and they taught me how to see the gaps in people's thought, and I can see the huge gap in Marxism and Marx's brave attempt to come up with a mathematical explanation for capitalism. He forgot military capitalism. He forgot or didn't realise that the greatest impulse towards capital accumulation is militarism and war. If you look back over the history of the last 400 years of European history, I'm reading a book about the 30 Years' War. which was the worst combat in Europe up till that point in the Holy Roman Empire, in Germany. Protestants and Catholics slaughtering each other ruthlessly, horrendously, for 30 years, you know. Eventually they made peace, and it became known as the Peace of Westphalia. Sweden got involved in the conflict, Spain was involved, the Dutch were involved. There were many wars going on simultaneously. The only reason the British didn't get involved is because they were having their own mini 30 Years' War called the English Civil War, or the British Civil War, because it raged all over Scotland, Ireland, Wales as well. And that was our own home match, so to speak, which was a nightmare too. Now, you know, the impact of that war on capitalism and capital accumulation is part of that story. The Dutch Empire was spreading, and the war was really a battle between the Spanish, who had their empire trading off to the Philippines, Manila and so on, and the Dutch. They were all competing for their own trade routes and their own profits. And that's one of the reasons for the wars. And you can see this in not just the 17th century, but the 18th century, where the French and British empires went, you know, endless wars with each other, and the Spanish. And it was all about capital and markets and profits. And the winners got the money. I mean, it's as simple as that. You know, the British beat the French, got Canada, captured that part of North America, and it helped the coffers back in Whitehall. Because we were able to tax and get the furs and the profits and blah, blah, blah. So the close linkage between the history of capital and capital accumulation and militarism was never touched by Marx. That's like the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th volumes of Das Kapital that never got written. And the thing is, what's weird is nobody's written it since. No single Marxist scholar, and I've looked through the literature in depth, no single Marxist scholar has ever realised A, it needs to be done, B, it's an essential part of the story, and C, let's get on with it and do it. I mean, how can you talk about the British in India, say, and you know, the whole good and bad effects of the British in India without looking at the history of capitalism and what were people doing in India? Why were the British there? What was their trading arrangements? Like, I don't know if people realise, but for instance, slavery was abolished by the English Parliament in 1832, but that didn't apply to India. Slavery was still going on in India up until after the mutiny, I think, or, you know, 1850s. And then it was only changed into indentured service, which was effectively slavery for a term of years. And that's how the British Empire then ran, because we had these indentured workers who were like contracted to 30 years' labour. They were rounded up in villages all over India and shipped to other parts of the British Empire. And if they protested, often they'd signed it without realising they were going outside India. They were shipped to Mauritius, for instance, which ran on these indentured servants. Effectively, you know, wage slaves or contract slaves. So that history is part of the history of capital and the history of conflict and war should be therefore rewritten into the history of Das Kapital. So anyway, now that's a mathematical challenge as well as a historical challenge. I mean, really, if you let's say you're a genius mathematician from another planet and you had a brain the size of 6 trillion Earth computers, and you could see and follow every single money trail that's going on simultaneously on this planet over the last 400 years, like every coin that changed hands, every pound note or paper money, every, you know, stocks and shares changing, now it's electronic money changing hands, whizzing around the planet. Let's say that your super angel can see all that happening. He would then, or she, probably a she, they're clever mathematicians like Hypatia, would track the flows of that money with occurrences of war and conflict. And there'd be not just one-to-one correlations, there would be subtle, complex and sophisticated you know, compilations and connections. Another factor is that the attempt to bring a sort of Marxist society into being in the Soviet Union, I think was premature, because Marx had never finished his homework. Marx never worked out the blueprint. There's nothing in Marx that tells you what a communist society will look like. And there was nothing, as I've said, in Marx that explained the real horrors of capitalism. The fact that it generates wars and does so to create profit. Marx, I don't think he realised how evil capitalism actually is. I think he thought it's just nasty factory owners making kids work long hours, you know. Yeah, he led a pretty sheltered bourgeois life, did Marx. He never realised actually. Yeah, I mean, he never went to India. He never worked, you know, on the plantations in South America. The southern states. Although he was dead against slavery, at least, and he wrote as much to Lincoln on behalf of the International Working Men's Commission. So, anyway, that's one of the things I've been working on, religion and maths, and it's very, very interesting. Also, I discovered it was a Jewish mathematician that built the Colossus, the computing machine that won World War II when it was employed to crack the Enigma codes and so on. Who founded the British Computing Society, a colleague of Turing, not famous, you know, but he's in my book. These are the unsung heroes of the war, the great mathematicians. There was another great Jewish mathematician who worked in Austria, and who was appalled at the, he was also in Germany, and he was appalled at the way Nazis were getting off in courts, even though they'd obviously committed such and such a crime. Judges were just letting them off because they were Nazis, wink, wink, you know. And he was, I think, a journalist or something, as well as a mathematician, who monitored some of these trials, saw what was going on, was so horrified. He fled Germany and Austria and ended up, I think, in England. And he invented a school of maths, which is, I can't remember the exact name, but it's extreme events mathematics. So, you know, normally floods are benign, but once every 100 years it will rise suddenly 100 feet in the air and smash into your defences. How can we compute that extreme event happening? And the same in every other field of either social events or whatever. Nazism was an extreme event. And he invented a maths that deals with these things, which is now in use. It's now been generalised to be used for all kinds of stuff. And I think Brexit is another example. You know, never in 400 years could we have foreseen the idiocy of the Brexit process. You know, it's the Titanic heading to the iceberg, and nobody is able to wake the captain. I.e. the Queen. She's asleep. Okay, so that's that. That's my religion and maths thing. That's going on. I want to just talk about time lags. There's a problem in knowledge. I've written this huge book called Being and Knowledge, and as an intellectual, a philosopher, someone that loves intellecting, you know, I've worked in schools and I've worked teaching at university level, and I've seen there's a time lag between the two. Where the intellectuals are working at the top level in universities is great. They are able to intellect. They can really, you know, move and work. They've got the solutions to most of the global predicaments we're in. The trouble is the time lag is several decades when those new ideas filter down into the curricula that are given in schools. And there's a whole bunch of gatekeeping institutions that come in the way. The curriculum assessment councils, the bodies of teachers that vet and monitor exam papers, and by the time that the new ideas have got down into the curriculum, they're already old. You know, it's 10, 20 years has gone by, 30, 40, and real thinking, intellecting has moved on to sort of a new integrative synthesis. So this is a problem. There's always a time lag between what the geniuses are thinking at the highest level of academia and what the teachers on the coalface are telling the kids. And this is a serious problem. structurally, how do we solve this? Well, I've been thinking about that. That's why I created my periodic table of the world's religions. I've tried to leapfrog. This is like, joined up thinking from the highest level of academic study of religious studies, but delivered to the coalface in the classroom in a way that the average RE teacher can actually make sense of and deliver to the kids. You see, I think kids themselves, because they can access the internet, that advanced level thinking is now available to them. The curricula, however, don't really accommodate it, incorporate it. So there's a problem there. And we're seeing this in the political disenfranchisement of actual teachers by government control of education. I find the way that the government has handled these grades going wrong in the educational structures in the UK is shocking. And, we need to rethink what education is for. It's not just for passing exams, it's for actually knowing things that are meaningful and that will help you become a better human being. That's why I've always said that ethics, religious studies and philosophy should be at least as big a component of the week curriculum for every school kid as mathematics. I love them both equally. I want maths to be taught better and in a more meaningful way. But I want, and more historically, because that's interesting, Egyptian maths, Babylonian, Greek, it gets the kids interested. But I also want religious studies to be taught in a much more meaningful, profound, deep way. And that's why I've created, the blueprint to enable that to happen. And then we can escape the time lag, because at the moment, things aren't looking very good for this planet. We've got the elites who are, there's a light war going on among the elites between, the dark forces that just want to keep the power, keep the knowledge, don't want it to trickle down to the kids or to anyone else. So that's deliberate, the time lag. And it's part of how capital functions, to hoard knowledge, power, information at the top of the pyramid, along with the guys inventing the weapons, and don't tell the peasants what we're up to, just keep it all from them. I mean, as we've seen, Marx tried to break through that racket, but failed because he didn't have enough brain power, actually. Marx wasn't very good at intellecting. There's a wonderful quote in Plato where it says that, Plato says in one of the dialogues, I think it's in the Socrates says, he says, "I've never met a mathematician that can actually reason." It's a great quote. What he means is that mathematicians are more like automatons that, you put in a formula, an equation, they come out with the answer. They can think in that sort of linear way. And they can juggle 10 different types of variables now with complicated maths and, different kinds of equations and functions. I mean, they can do that. But that's just what automata do, and computers can do that too. What they can't do is reason. And what Plato meant by that is dialectical thinking, where you synthesize whole new fields of knowledge and whole new approaches and perspectives. It's where you get intellecting. And it's what the Jains were talking about, by 4 types of intellecting going on simultaneously. No, that's beyond maths. And that's why we need to challenge that sort of elite group, that the one thing these elite mathematicians don't want is any ethics to go into that system. Because maths runs without any kind of ethics. It just describes stuff, what is, and that's it. It's an objective science. Well, sorry folks, that's not what the world does. Maths is therefore untrue in its mission, which is to describe the world as it actually is, because it's not factoring in the invisible, intangible, ethical, metaphysical, psychological dimension of human life, which is what gives human life meaning. Where's the mathematics of love? Why am I attracted to this person and not to that person? And why do I fall head over heels for that person? Where's the maths for that? Nobody's even asked the questions, apart from Sorokin, who tried to do a deep study on altruism and love in different epochs and civilizations. That's why I launched the Love Journal, to look at love. Right, so I launched the Love Journal years ago at the Institute of Education, where I used to teach teachers, doing my research onto the early days of peace studies, setting up the institute I now still direct. And the Institute of Education is the leading educational centre in Britain, one of the most important in the English-speaking world, indeed in the world, about what is education, what's it for, how can we get it better. So my remarks about the time lag stuff, they're based on years of study and research. I also worked as a teacher at the coalface, and I know about the problem of the time lag. Now, I just want to flag up, there's a very interesting new development happening politically in Britain at the moment. The Liberal Democrat Party, which is a sort of centre-left coalition of forces. It's part of the old Social Democrat Party and the Liberal Party, and a lot of Greens are involved and so on. It's more like a think tank than a party, but they're mostly very good people, and they're really trying to think through alternatives for Britain, opposing Brexit, opposing the narrow racist nationalism that's been whipped up by the Conservative Party, the xenophobes. And they're good people. And one of the candidates standing is a woman called Layla Moran, who's the MP for Abingdon in Oxfordshire. I've been listening carefully to her and Ed Davey talking, and trying to weigh up, which candidate I think has got the qualities. I'm afraid when Layla Moran confessed she'd done a master's degree at the Institute of Education in comparative education, I think that clinched it for me. She is actually a high caliber thinker. She can do intellecting. And if we believe in the role of intellect in helping to salvage our broken country, then I think Layla might be just the godsend we need. She happens to be an amazing, clever woman. So, the trouble is, of course, Ed Davey is also very intelligent. Nothing against him. He's the old style, bruiser in politics, been an MP for 20 years. And he will appeal to the broad masses. That's the argument. So no, he's the best candidate to be the leader, because he'll get ordinary Joe on the street who's a little bit racist but won't admit it, who's a little bit hates Europe but won't admit it, who kind of votes Tory but doesn't really, because they don't like Johnson. So they might be one back. So you go for Ed Davey because he's more pragmatic and sellable. I don't think that argument is really ethical, because it's saying go for the guy that you don't think is the more intelligent, because he'll appeal to unintelligent people. I mean, what kind of weird argument would that be? No, I think you've got to go for Layla Moran and have faith in the British people's intelligence to think through the complexity of the affair we're in. Boris Johnson, whoever this leader they elect, is going to be hopefully making a pact with Keir Starmer and the Greens and the SNP to oppose. To me, that's the number one priority, is to get a progressive, progressive centre-left, Green alliance together with the Celtic fringe parties to oppose Boris Johnson. Now, Boris Johnson is also quite clever, but he's one of the elite, let's keep it all for ourselves types. I mean, the whole way of his thinking and the way the Tory party thinks, and has done since Disraeli, is we'll just control everything. That's fine. You leave it to us. We'll take it. We control the banks. We'll control the military. We'll decide military policy. We'll decide everything. We're the Conservative Party. Trust us. We're clever. We run the intelligence services. You can't do any thinking unless you join us. You can't get on in life. That's the old school approach. No, that's got to change, and that's where Boris comes from. That's the people that put him in power. That's same people behind Dominic Cummings, the whole crew. Now it's time to blow the whistle on that lot, and I think Layla and Ed Davey together, and everyone else, and Labour and SNP and the Plaid Cymru and the Greens,